Welcome to another episode of Corporate CPR, where we breathe life back into your organization's projects and processes, giving you insights to recovery and avoiding corporate mortality events. Today, we'll be talking about performance management, and joining us to contribute to the conversation is Irial O'Farrell. Welcome. I'm so glad to have you.
Delighted to be here. Thank you very much.
Do you want to introduce a little bit about your background and what your journey?
Yeah, quite an eclectic background. I originally did science in college, so physics and maths, and ended up working in financial services in Australia. And I was endlessly fascinated how there was two managers, one everybody loved, the other one everybody avoided. And I was just fascinated with what's the person that everybody loves doing and what's the person that people avoid doing, and what's what makes it work and what makes it not work. So I thought that was a bit of a blip in my interests, and it turned out to be actually the passion of my life in terms of work. So I moved to Boston in the US and worked there for about 4 years, and was again that fascinated with how do you match the needs of the individual and the performance of the business, or the needs of the business. So it's this symbiotic relationship. And both they sort of both need to work. So I've just always been that, what is it that helps people to perform at the right levels, and what does the business need in terms of the performance. And so that's brought me on a very interesting journey through management, through organization design. My last 6 months in Boston was an organization design project arising out of a merger, which was really interesting because if you've worked in a big organization and you've never been involved in an org design project, you don't really realize how the behaviors are influenced and impacted by the organization and how it's designed. So moved back to Ireland in 1999, ended up moving into training and development, and worked for about 6 years in an organization running the L&D space. And originally in technical, and then into the management development, and then into the whole, or the how do you recruit people, how do you manage the performance. So I got heavily involved into competency frameworks and embedding those into the performance management process. And then in about 2006, I set up Evolution Consulting. So did a lot of leadership development work, a lot of performance management, a lot of working at different levels in the organization, and how people need to move from one level to the other level in terms of performance and development, and ensuring that the actual organization delivers what it's designed to deliver. So it's been an eclectic journey. Again, as part of that sort of change organization design, I've also written 3 books, values, not just for the office wall plaque, around how our values show up for us individually and then in the organization. Then 2020, I wrote Smart Objective Setting for managers, which is taking that idea of objective setting using the SMART framework, but using it as a two-way conversation rather than just going through the S, the M, the A, the O, the T. And then earlier this year, I wrote and published The Manager's Dilemma: How to Empower Your Team's Problem Solving.
It's great. Well, obviously, people are a critical component to keeping organizations healthy, because they're obviously what makes up the organization. So it would be a great topic for today. And I think you have, maybe an interesting take on, the term performance management. It sounds like maybe that's not the term we should be using. So maybe let's start there. What's wrong with performance management as it is today?
Yeah, well, to me, I'm not mad about the word management. I prefer performance development, because for me, it's not so much we're trying to manage it; it's that we're trying to develop it so that people grow into their roles and are able to be competent in their roles and to deliver their roles. And then we also need to be able to develop them to the next level, whether that's lateral or whether it's up. Because the organization its needs are constantly changing. If organizations are growing, they need people who are able to grow and into more senior roles or different roles, if there's new roles coming into play that the organization needs. So to me, it's more around, we're not doing it to manage it, we're doing it to develop people and to if somebody's new into a role, we're doing them to develop their skills and knowledge and experience into being able to deliver that role. And if they are, if we're need, again, in some organizations they have a constant need for people to move through and organize a function into other functions. They're almost like feeding functions, so they need to be enabled to do that, and to constantly develop into the new roles to meet the business's needs and to meet their own needs as well, because obviously we do prefer, like, nobody wants to go to work and do the same job a day in, day out and never learn anything, and people get bored, and so therefore there's the whole retention part of it as well. So even I always call it performance management and development, but my preference is actually performance development.
And I think a lot of work has been made in this area around trying to change the way people think about developing their people, and that it shouldn't be this once a year review. But it still seems like, I mean, I guess I'd be curious if the organizations that you're seeing, is it still really tied around that annual performance review, and then often tied to the compensation at the same time, versus kind of developing on a journey throughout the whole year? What are your observations there?
I think on the whole, it's still very much that annual cycle. And in fact, even some organizations are still doing that whole benchmarking and the whole contentious ratings, and it has to go into the bell curve. And to me, that's completely defeats the purpose of it. So yeah, a lot of organizations, the management are still, they're still doing that, sort of setting the objectives at the beginning of the year, reviewing them at the end of the year. Maybe there's a check-in halfway through the year if you're lucky. By the end of the year, the organization has moved on, and so half the objectives are no longer relevant anymore. So the whole thing is set up for an awful lot of conflict. And it's like it's a process that we have to go through because we're told to go through it, but we don't really know what the purpose of it is. And the purpose of it really is to, what are we trying to do when we're looking at performance, and what do we mean by performance? And it's kind of what's the knowledge, the skills, and the capabilities required to do the role, and what's the role designed to do. And a lot of times we're not even clear, managers aren't clear around what a role is designed to deliver. So it's very hard if you don't have a benchmark, if you don't have a clear picture of what is it that this role needs to deliver. How do I know if somebody's doing it right? Or how do I know where they need to change or to finesse or to adjust? And so what I find is managers don't have that image in their heads around, here's the ideal of what good looks like in this role. And so it's very hard to set objectives correctly, or give proper feedback or effective feedback, because it's going into a bit of a vacuum. They're not sure, they're not comfortable. So if anybody questions it, they sort of completely, I suppose there's a fear factor that they will be questioned because they don't have the answer. So it makes it very difficult to have that conversation. So then they're afraid of it, and then they are kind of going, yeah, we'll just leave that over there and hope it doesn't come up again.
I worked at an organization where it was in a retail organization, and so every store had to have a bottom performer in each layer, right? So you have the general manager of the store, and then you've got all the next layer managers, and one of them always had to be the bottom performer. That was like the rule of the organization, which I find incredibly, I mean, I guess you always might have a bottom performer in a group of people. You might, like if you put everybody on a scale, somebody might be at the bottom, but their definition of the bottom performer is then they had to be on a performance management plan, and improving them or moving them out, which seems to be pretty extreme. Like you could lose good talent that way. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. And that's that. Well, this is thanks to Jack Welch, was the 10%, the bottom 10% had to be either they were put on a plan and they either improved or they were out, and that is a legacy from that in the 90s. Absolutely. I fundamentally don't agree with it. I fundamentally think it misses the point of performance and performance development and what we're doing it for. And again, it goes back to that benchmark. If you don't have a clear benchmark around what good, what the standard of the performance required for the role is, you're always going to inevitably get somebody at the bottom, because somebody has to be at the bottom. But the question is the person at the bottom, are they still doing the job that they're supposed
Right.
to be doing? So,
Exactly.
and is everybody else the top performer? So when you don't have that benchmark to be able to answer that question, then you're going to, it's very easy to end up in that situation. And the person could be doing a very good job. They're doing the job that they're there to do. And that to me is what the purpose of the organization, when you look at it, and what it's designed by roles, by the purpose of the roles, by what the roles are there to deliver. And if those roles are delivered, if the purpose of those roles are delivered, then the organization is working.
Mm-hmm.
If those roles aren't being delivered, then we've got a performance issue. But just to turn around and say, well, somebody has got to be at the bottom, and so therefore they aren't doing a good enough job, even though we don't really know what good enough looks like, to me is just so defeating, self-defeating for the organization, because that causes ripples in the organization. You get really angry, really upset, really negative people. And they might be going, I don't know what I can do differently because I'm not being told. It seems to be I'm doing the standard that's expected. And that causes ripple effects. And I've seen people where they've been good performers and they've been pushed into that position because somebody has to be in it. And you're going,
Yeah.
it's mad.
I found myself on the list one time, and the feedback I got was that I wasn't engaging and inspiring enough. And I said, okay, well, who then in this group can I model myself after that is engaging and inspiring? And the manager couldn't give me a person. So it's like, okay, so and that's how I realized, okay, I've been picked as the bottom one. I see what's going on here, and you're making up crap because you can't tell me what engaging and inspiring looks like.
And that's a perfect example of what I was saying earlier.
Hmm.
Managers don't know how to answer that question because they don't have the picture in their head. They don't know what the standard is. And so therefore they're just being told, we'll have to come up with something. So I'll tell you this. And then if you challenge it at all, they just crumble. And then they become, their credibility is lost.
Exactly.
You know,
Well, honestly, I lost all respect for. So this was somebody who, at the time, I was one of my favorite messages or managers that I had so far.
yeah,
And so that was the other piece. It was completely handled incorrectly in the sense that one day I show up into the office and I'm told, you're not meeting expectations because you're not engaging and inspiring enough, when the day before we were playing foosball in the lunchroom. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there was no indication that there was a problem. And ironically, that scarred me for the next 5 years or so. Anytime a manager asked me to come to the office, I would break out in heart palpitations and start sweating because I'm like, oh
yeah,
my goodness, did I do something wrong?
yeah.
Which I think maybe you could talk a little bit about that, like the whole concept of people shouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my core messages whenever I'm talking to managers about things is there should be no surprises. The number one rule of performance development is no surprises. So
Mm-hmm.
actually the feedback session should be, the end of year review kind of conversation should be the easiest conversation,
Right.
because you should literally be going, oh, we've talked about this and you know about that and you know where you are with this. Da, 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 da. Yeah, grand. Okay. There should be no contention
Mm-hmm.
by the time you get to that review meeting, because everything should have already been brought to the attention. And often when I'm working with managers, especially when you're doing a changeover from one system to a new system, that's a very common question that they'll be going, well, should I say something? And my first question is always, well, have you ever had this conversation with them before?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to close out the old system by doing the review, and we're going to open with the new system. Have you ever talked to them before about it? And they're like, no, I've never mentioned it. And I'll be like, wouldn't be bringing it up in the review meeting then, because it's just going to be contentious, because they're going to be shocked. They are going to be, why is this the first time that I'm hearing this? How have I not been given any opportunities to
Mm-hmm.
change or make improvements, or to understand what I need to do to make a difference here? So people feel tricked. they feel like, why is this the first time you're bringing this to my attention? And then it does make the whole thing really contentious. It makes people hate the process. But in actual fact, it should be a really positive thing, because it should be saying, actually, here is how you need to develop and progress and grow, and, into your current role or into other opportunities that you're interested in. But managers aren't trained to do that. It's like they get promoted to management, and it's like, well, you're manager there, you should automatically know how to do these things. And they're going, what, based on the experiences I've had previously with my own manager? It's this.
Yeah. No, I feel like I've been very fortunate in that, again, working at the retail, they did put a lot of focus on the performance development, right or wrong. And I mean, in execution, but there was a lot of focus. There's a lot of training. So we were taught how to make our own individual development plans. We were taught how to interview. Like, I mean, we had to do a lot of interviewing, and they did, they had really great scenario-based interviewing. So tell me about a time, and so I've taken that. So, I'll be interviewing project managers. So tell me about a time you've been on a project that started going off track. How did you respond? And it's a great way to then, draw out conversation. So, and that for me came from retail, and I haven't seen that level of, I guess, training in corporate environment that I did in the retail environment. So I feel really lucky. I'd love to hear, if you have a framework, or, kind of what are the key elements then of a good performance development, system or process?
Yeah. So what I've actually, as I mentioned in my introduction, I've done quite a lot of work in competency frameworks, which is a lot of times the behavioral frameworks, the behavioral expectation, I suppose, observable behaviors that we can see people observe. But what I found is that managers actually they don't find them particularly intuitive. So they find them quite difficult to incorporate into developing people, or incorporating into setting out kind of what is expected around the particular behavior. So what I've actually, in the last 2 years, started doing is working with clients to build out what I call role dimensions. So one of my observations is that every organization has requirements around communication, or around problem solving, or around leadership. There's, if you like, spectra or of that every single organization needs something around in its organization. But the specifics about it might be slightly different. So what one organization might expect around communication might be different to another organization. So what I've started working with was what I call role dimensions, which are naming these, communication, leadership, problem solving, influencing, whatever it is. And working with clients to build out a framework for their job families. So what it does is it captures the culture of the organization, but it also captures what's expected of different roles within a job family within the organization. And so what it does is, by the time you've built out the framework, you actually have a clear understanding of all the elements of what's expected in a role, in a job family, in the organization. But it also sets out how those expectations change as we move from one level to another. It's not just competence, so it's not just behavioral. It also brings in the outputs or the outcomes of the role. It brings in the knowledge and the technical knowledge required in the role, maybe some of the systems, that kind of thing. So it maps out the sort of expectations of the roles well in above what a job description maps out. So this infrastructure that's missing in organizations. So what that allows is that managers have a very clear view of what am I expecting from this role, and then they have a benchmark to be able to go, when they're meeting with Johnny, for example, they're able to say, I'm not seeing, your communication, or I'm not seeing. So they have something that's very tangible for people to understand. Oh, that's what I'm not doing. Or that's my gap. That's what I need to work on. And what it also helps is set out how the expectations change as you move up the different levels in an organization. So it differentiates between a senior and a junior, or it differentiates between frontline manager and a middle manager. And what inevitably happens is that as you look through it or whatever, you can see how the technical becomes less important as you move up the ranks, and the management and the influencing and the softer skills of leadership become much more important. But and given I loved your podcast name, Corporate CPR, is brilliant. Because what happens is the more senior we get, the less tangible the jobs are, and the less tangible the tasks are. And so without really knowing or understanding where should I be spending my time, a lot of times managers will regress and do work that's more tangible, the doing work, and which sets out what ends up happening is the work ends up being done at the wrong levels in the organization, which which over time in a function, or if it's happening all over the organization, can grind the organization down, because the organization isn't being done, the full extent of the organization, the system of it isn't being operated properly. So what this framework helps people do is it helps individuals understand what's expected of them in their current role and what's expected in other roles that they might be interested in terms of their job development or their career development. But it also gives managers the framework of going, this is what the role is about, and that's our benchmark. And it so becomes about the benchmark of the role rather than, well, you're not doing the job as well as Johnny's doing the job, which is often how managers determine performance. I'll compare it to my top performer of the person doing the role instead of what's the role designed to do. So
yeah. I actually had a really good experience with a company who had that type of framework, and it really, I guess, helped from I wasn't a manager there, so I don't know what kind of training they offered on that side, but from my perspective, it was, I could see they had that, like, here you are, and here's what we'd expect from the next level up, like a director. And these are the soft skills and the technical skills that so it made it really easy to be like, all right, so I'm going to work on that, or I need an experience that's going to teach me that. And it was much easier to even map out my own development with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really, when it's mapped out, it takes a bit of work to map it out. But when it is mapped out, you get a lot of people going, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense that I need to, or that makes sense that that's how my role is different to that role. So people can see the differences, which brings it to life an awful lot more. It helps with succession planning, and it helps with building out the bench strength of the team, or the function, or the company as a whole. Because again, from an organizational perspective, performance development is around, if something happened to somebody in a role, do we have anybody who can step into that role? Do we have somebody who's ready, or who's able, or has the potential? So you want bench strength. You want 2 or 3 people. If it's a really well run, well functioning organization, having 2 or 3 people who are ready or almost ready to step into it makes the organization much stronger than scrabbling around for somebody going, gee, who's going to do that? Who's going to step into that, or whatever? And we'll throw them in and hope for the best. So by having that, it helps with succession planning. It helps with the bench strength of the organization. It also helps with change. When organizations change and roles change and that kind of stuff, you have something to kind of go into and intervene and say, well, we wanted you to have that knowledge previously, but now the knowledge we want you to have, or the skill sets we want you to have, is this. So it's clear to everybody, it's communicated to everybody, but they have an intervention, it's something to intervene with, rather than just saying, yeah, we need people to be more innovative now.
Right.
Great. What does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. What does that mean? No, that's yeah, exactly. And so it sounds like you start with a framework of, these are the characteristics and the competencies that we expect at each level. Then you, I assume, offer some sort of training so that everybody's clear on what that means, both at a manager perspective and an employee perspective. And then what about once all that's set up, what's next?
Yeah. So from a development, again, from that performance developmental perspective, I break out objectives into developing people into the role. So are they able to do the role currently, or are they still learning the role? So the objectives that we need to set to develop them, to get them up to speed 100% in their role. And then from there, once they're ready, once they're competent in the role, what do we need to do to develop them or to link them to strategic objectives? So there's the development into the role, to strategic objectives, and then there's technical and behavioral objectives that you might set. So I kind of split it out into getting somebody developed up to being competent in the role, and then how do we develop them further? How do we kind of keep them interested and further develop them to be able to for their own career development and for the needs of the business. And then so it's around that, having that kind of clear, where are you now? Where do you need to get to? And then how do we close out the set out objectives to close that out? But I also, when it comes to the ratings, I look at it very differently. So a lot of organizations will use like a 1 to 4, or highly effective, or effective, exceeds expectations, that type of thing. Whereas I use and again, if you use numbers, a lot of organizations, they'll use that 1 to 5, where 3 is the middle one, where that's where they're expecting most people to end up being, again, with the bell curve, 64% roughly should fall into the 3. So I again, when it comes to looking at how people react to that, I have a few different thoughts on it. One is how come, why if we've got a level 4 and a level 5 when it comes to performance, why are we setting the standard performance at like a 3, and then saying there's 2 levels of performance above that are possible? You think about the message that sends out. You're kind of going, why would we have 2 additional levels? Why wouldn't we set the standard at 4? Why wouldn't we say that actually that's the standard we expect everybody to be at, and some people will exceed it, but most people won't? So again, a lot of times people are going, well, what would I need to do to get a 5? And nobody knows the answer. I don't know. Nobody knows. But also on the flip side of that, if you've got a 1 and a 2, okay, if you've got a 1, if somebody's getting a 1 rating where 1 is the worst and 5 is the best, if you've got a 1 rating, obviously somebody's seriously underperforming there. But a lot of times you get a rating of a 2, that they're not meeting expectations. But there are 2 different reasons why they're not, 2 broad reasons. One is that they are underperforming. The other is that they're actually still learning their role.
Okay.
And it's not possible for them to have met expectations yet, because they're still learning their role. And again, if you think about how performance management has been around since around the 1950s, and a lot of it was built initially around manufacturing and being able to see what's produced. But we're now in the 2020s, 70 years later, and an awful lot of work is knowledge work. So it's an awful lot more complex. Like the technology has taken away a lot of the more basic tasks of entry level and junior jobs. So those jobs have become more complex. So you're not just going to walk in and like within a 12-month period have mastered the role, because the role is much more complex than it was 20 or 30 or 50 years ago. But turning around to somebody and saying, your rating is the same as somebody who's underperforming, because you couldn't possibly have mastered it yet, you couldn't possibly have gotten to the point of meeting expectations yet, is a really demeaning, really demotivating things for people.
Absolutely. It's also harder to evaluate, I think, too, in the sense that, so a lot of times now as leaders, we might take over departments that maybe we don't have direct, like, hands-on experience. And I ran an IT department for a few months, and it was really difficult for me to evaluate how those people were performing. I do IT projects all day long, and in my head, I was like, oh, well, I feel like maybe the team's not getting as much done as they should, but I don't know how to measure that. And, they've been here for a long time, and so far everybody loves them. But from my perspective, I'm wondering if there's, this issue. And then it was the pandemic as well. So, we were all remote. And so that was even more like, does this person even like work full time? Not that I'm a minute counter or anything, but it just seemed like they would disappear and I had no way of knowing. So I find that, in that way, it can be really hard to measure, just in the sense that if you haven't done the work, but you've got leadership skills, so they expect you to come in and be able to lead a department. You as a manager, it takes a while to get competent.
Absolutely. And that's what, going back to the role dimensions, built into the role dimensions is the outputs, or the expected outputs, or the expected outcomes. So the more senior it gets, the more it gets into outcomes rather than outputs. So again, a lot of managers don't know what is what are the outputs of this. So if it was, in your example there at the IT, let's just say they're doing IT projects, is it reasonable for somebody to do 3 projects over the course of a year? Is
Right.
it 1 project and it's going to go on for the next 2 years? Should they be doing 20 projects? Do we have sight of that? Do we have sight of the types of, they should be doing 3 complex ones and 2 vanilla projects over the course of a year? What's a reasonable output? And so a lot of times, and it's getting harder and harder as we get more into knowledge work. It's getting harder and harder to say, what is the output of this? So then it's hard to know, are they performing? I don't know, because I don't really know I don't have any benchmarks. So again, it goes back to the benchmarks and not having them. And so
Yep.
therefore not really knowing. And then, if you don't know and you're not clear about it, then they can get into quite a contentious discussion around, well, I think it takes 6 months to do a project, and you're thinking, I think it should take about 3.
Well, yeah, we were talking about a contract negotiation, like settling on scope of this project, between us and a vendor. It was taking the person working for me, 2 months. And I'm just like, yeah, I don't understand what's so hard about agreeing on like scope. And are you holding the vendor accountable to doing their side? And are you being pushy enough, really, right? Like, but I guess the other piece there, is because of how that organization operated. They might not have been clear. I mean, there would be no way I would step in and say you're not meeting expectations, because I know expectations hadn't been set. And that was kind of the process I was working through, is like, what should the expectations be? And then we'll communicate them. So, from even what you're saying, like, I would have never walked into a review process and been like, no, you're not meeting expectations, because nobody's ever told them. The expectation is we turn SOWs around in 30 days, or whatever is a reasonable time. But that was very indicative of that environment, though, of like, they spent all this time writing, they had job descriptions, and they had you had to sign anytime you took over a new role, that you understand like what the expectations of that role were. But it didn't, it was like missing a piece. It was still very, yeah, that sounds great on paper, but what does that actually look like?
Yeah. And role job descriptions, I think people go, well, what was in the role description? But the role description is a very general and generic description. It doesn't get into, it'll say, well, manage something, or lead out something, or deliver something. These are all very, but what are the steps, or what goes into making that? And of course, people will have different interpretations of it. And that's what I found. I found that there is this missing link from job descriptions, from the org design piece of it. And I know a lot of organizations evolve, and they never question, well, what is the role designed to deliver? And then the managers aren't clear around they don't have a clear vision for the role, or for the whatever number of roles they have in their team. They don't have a clear vision for what the standard is. And so therefore it's very hard to have these conversations. And I agree with you, there is something missing in it. And to me, it's that role dimensions, that having that framework that explains it from, literally top to bottom, like, this is what's expected of the role. So that people then understand, and people can then have that conversation around, these are the expectations. And oftentimes when I've worked with clients to bring it into the organization, a lot of times with the staff, that when they're looking at it for the first time, they're going, I didn't know I was supposed to do that. I didn't know that was part of my job. nobody ever told me that. And it was like, well, yeah, in order for this job to be done, this job description to be delivered, this is what we expect.
Mm.
Um, and so it brings everybody onto the same page around the expectations
Yeah.
as well. So I think that's a really, really important part of it is having that everybody's on the same page around what is expected of the role. Um, so yeah.
And then how do you manage to those expectations though, then throughout the year in your, like, how do you design that, the actual performance development throughout the year?
Yeah. So that's kind of getting into that coaching, manager as coach and leader as coach type thing. So it is getting, it's some of it's observation, paying attention, getting other people's feedback around what's happening, how the person's getting on, that type of thing, checking in with them. And again, it's taken the time to really, if there's been a particularly behavioral developments, so people get very squeamish about if there's it's not, you don't know, that technical piece is one thing, is that's knowledge. But when you start kind of saying this behavior, I'm not seeing this behavior, expected behavior, it can
Mm.
feel very squeamish because it can feel very personal.
Yeah.
Um, so it is then, so it's kind of, how do you frame the behavioral pieces? One question, how I frame it, or how I question or tease out why this matters, is what's the business impact.
Yeah.
So if there's a business impact from it, then it matters. If the person can't put it in terms of a business impact, then it's their own, that's just how they like things. It's their own idiosyncrasy is what I call that, as opposed to saying, when you keep saying you're going to deliver that piece of work and it's not delivered, it has an impact on people trusting what you
Hmm.
say, because if you keep promising something and you don't deliver it, then that's hurting your reputation, and people stop trusting that. So it's when you're able to put it in the business impact terms, then it makes it less personal. um,
Yeah, and I don't remember which framework, but that's that method, that those steps of when, here's what I saw, here's what the impact is, and here's the expectation. We learned that in retail as well. Spent a lot of time
yeah,
framing it that way, and it's honestly good even in interpersonal relationships. Like obviously, then it's not the business impact. It's here's how it impacted me. Like
mm,
rather than accusing somebody of having a certain characteristic, you're saying,
yeah,
well, when you do this action, here's how, what I observe and how it makes me feel.
yeah,
What I'd like to see is this. And obviously in an interpersonal relationship, that then there's negotiation there, but
yeah,
at least you're not, it doesn't come off as accusatory.
yeah, yeah. And that that it's personal to the
Mm.
person, so that's where it becomes, and a lot of times managers won't have that conversation because it feels extremely uncomfortable, and it can get, there's the fear factor comes in again, that it can become extremely personal, that the person can react. And again, that's where it's very helpful to have the framework to say, this is the role, this is what the role needs, this is the expectations of the role. So it's not like I'm changing the rules for you compared to somebody else. So again, the human being the human, what one might let slide with one person who's doing a very good job, one might not let it slide with somebody else, and so we can start,
Mm.
seeing, are we playing favorites and that kind of stuff, where again, there's this benchmark of what the expectations are, and being consistent with it. Then you're not, I suppose you're less open to the accusation of, you're picking on me because you don't ask them to do it.
Right.
Whereas you're able to say, well, actually, this is what the role requires, and that's what I'm looking at. That's my benchmark. I'm not comparing you to somebody else. I'm comparing you to the benchmark.
Yeah, and I could see where, like, having a benchmark, you could, if everybody got evaluated against a constant, you could actually have a organization of top performers because it's
Yes.
measured against that benchmark. And so you may have all the top, you might still have somebody who's not, obviously people are all on a spectrum, and in your organization, you may have somebody who's on the bottom, at the bottom of your organization. But then if you were to do a market analysis of everybody else out there, they might still be smoking everyone in their performance. And so that's where, that would make a strong case for having just more independent benchmarks rather than let's just compare everybody against each other, because you might have an organization that all your people outperform people at other organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually having the role dimensions framework actually allows you, because the way I design it is I don't say pick your top performer, because not everybody is a top performer. So I'll pick the kind of what's the role designed to deliver. Let's pick that as the benchmark, and then there will be people who will exceed that. So you want it to be accessible to the majority of people who can do the job, rather than setting out a standard that's too high, that's in excess of what's required and in excess of what a lot of people will be able to deliver on a consistent basis. So by having this the role dimensions and developing everybody to it, you do actually end up with people who are, I often have seen whereby people end up in the situation where they are performing a lot higher. You do actually end up with high performing teams off the back of it.
Do you feel that as part of this as well, that compensation reviews should be separated from actual performance development and performance reviews?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, because I could see why you need to have make tougher decisions when you're tying it to how much more money are we giving people, because you have a limited pool of money. And so you could still put that structure in without impacting the way somebody's performance is being evaluated if it was separated, right? You could still say, hey, you exceeded expectations, but unfortunately, once we force ranked everybody, you didn't exceed them as much as somebody else, but I'm not going to take your evaluation away and now say, even though you're really exceeding expectations, I'm just going to say you're competent because I have to, because the money is tied to it.
Yeah. And that really destroys the whole conversation. And that's where you do get to performance management, because you are managing the process as opposed to developing people. And then interestingly, that is where a lot of the history of performance management came from. The need, I think it was in the 70s, where pay rises were getting out of control, and they needed a mechanism to determine who they were going to give pay rises, or how much of a pay rise was going to be given. So they needed a mechanism, and so they linked it to performance management, and kind of said, well, we'll come up with a rating, and like whoever gets the 4s gets this, and whoever gets the 5s gets. And so that is, I suppose, it's very linked to it. And that also makes it really difficult to have conversations about development around the person and where they're at and where their development is at, because the managers often feel, I need to give them a good rating, even if they're not that good. I need to give them a good rating because I can't afford to lose them, particularly in a tight market. So a tight market, or a market whereby it's very difficult to keep people or attract people or find people. That might be, could be a specific industry that struggles with getting a certain skill set. And so they end up keeping them because, and telling them they're doing well, even though they're not actually performing necessarily that well. But it's better to do that than it is to run the risk of losing them.
A little off topic, but it goes back to something you said earlier. A thought I've been toying around with is, how could you build compensation that was tied to deliverables, so that it's no longer how many hours do you work or anything like that. It's this deliverable is worth $10,000 to us or something, and you get paid for the more on the deliverable basis. And where I got the idea from was, we've undertaken at Project Genetics some fixed price projects. So we're like, this is what we're going to deliver you, and this is how much it's going to cost you. And we might even have subcontractors who then, subcontract to us on a fixed price basis. So I don't care how much time they work. If they get it done faster, as long as, you'd obviously have to have clear quality measures and things like that. But why should I care about what time you're working? I know what this is going to cost. I'm struggling with how you could scale that, but I really kind of like the idea, because then if people want to, if they're kind of slow and plod along, but they still get the job done, then that's up to them. Or if you're a person who buckles down and can get it done faster, then your rate per hour goes up. But I'm just curious if you've ever thought about that, or what your reaction might be.
Yeah, it's a very interesting concept. And I suppose because in some industries they do quite a lot of outsourcing, or they contract things, and it just done on the deliverable. I'm not. I suppose if you're scaling a company and growing the company, my part of it would be you'd need to build in the expected behaviors, the how they go about it as well. So it can't just be the what they deliver, but the how needs to be brought in as well. So it would take quite a while to finesse that process, I think.
Yeah, I think it's so counter to how we operate today. It would definitely be difficult to implement. But well, Irial, this has been a great conversation. I'd love to hear, in closing, either kind of your 3 key takeaways, either that you brought up already, or if we haven't touched on something that you think is important. But what are kind of 3 key takeaways you'd want people to think about when approaching performance development?
One would be definitely have that framework in your head around what the standard of performance is, that the job is what it is set at, and having that clear picture in your head around what the standard of the performance in the role is, and then share that. Make sure everybody else in the team understands what that standard is, and that they're all on the same page as to what those standards are. And then it's the no surprises. So it's that constant feedback, the constant conversations going on throughout the year to end up that the person is developing and getting to where they need to get to by the end of the year.
Okay, that's great. Well, Irial, if people wanted to reach out to you or learn more about what you do, what's the best way of doing that?
My website is evolutionconsulting.ie, so www.evolutionconsulting.ie, and my books are available on Amazon and also my website.
Well, great. Thanks so much for being a guest today.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's been great talking to you.
You too. And to our audience, until next time, keep your corporations healthy.